Hello, and thank you once again for coming along to Eco Views and News. This week we're going to look at some of the voices that came out in Durban, South Africa. There's been a very important meeting there of the Conference of Parties. It was called the COP17, the 17th meeting of the Conference of Parties. And in effect they came to a number of decisions, but the decision process was long and complicated and deserves some attention. What voices were heard in the COP17? What voices were kept outside of the convention hall? What voices got recorded anyway outside the hall, in a sense, the protesting voice? And what voices were outside of the country altogether that were being heard inside the convention hall? These are the different things we want to look at today. And so we're going to call this, in a sense, global crisis and global voices, voices that are coming in from several different sources. We're going to look at this question of international and intergenerational equity. It is the question of fairness between nations and between generations in Durban. Well, we heard the president of the conference, Foreign Minister of South Africa, invoke Albert Luthuli, who was the first Nobel laureate in South Africa, in fact in all of Africa, as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate. You recall what she said at the time. Let's call up the sound on this, if we can, in a way that we can hear it.
He was a man who achieved the highest award against all odds, a prize for peace in a country where at the time there was none. Excellencies and colleagues, let us take a brief moment here and take a step back in history and remind ourselves where we came from with this climate change process. We were able to negotiate the foundation of the system we have today. We concluded the convention and were able to craft the Kyoto Protocol. Some of you were personally involved in these milestone events. Bearing these accomplishments in mind, I have to urge you not to lose the ability to be courageous pioneers in the climate change process. Excellencies, let us therefore agree to accept the Durban outcome package.
Okay, she made the appeal for, let us therefore agree to accept the Durban outcome package. And it was that she, in effect, used as a means of convening everyone to think about the outcome. But in the process, we needn't lose sight of the different voices from different delegations. And in fact, we ought to go back and review them with some care. In particular, India's chief climate delegate at the meetings in Durban emphasized the problem of equity in reaching a global accord, and she felt that a lot of the principles of Kyoto were being overlooked, in effect. The common and differentiated responsibility meant that the industrialized world, according to the Kyoto Protocol, was supposed to take the lead and share the effort with the world as a whole by demonstrating that it, since it had benefited from the use of carbon, could help the developing countries beyond the point where they are dependent upon carbon, and therefore lead in the restraint process of emitting more carbon. And she felt that that equity principle had been lost. She's very forthright. Declares at one point, this is not about India, it's about the entire world. Does climate change mean that you give up equity, is the way she put it. She pronounces it equity, but listen to her impassioned appeal for equity and fairness. It's really very moving if you listen to the mood of the room as well. Let's call it up here a second. It's really quite effective.
We are here to find a solution to the entire issue of the problem of climate change, and if I may repeat with the greatest respect, we have shown more flexibility than virtually any other party in this process. We gave 3 agenda items to be included, and Madam, I would like to say the centerpiece of the climate change debate is equity. And I would like to ask if any party here would disagree with me if I say that the centerpiece of a climate change debate is and has to be equity. And the equity of burden sharing cannot be shifted. Cannot be shifted. Madam, I have heard, and before the process began, so many people came to me and asked about this one word that has been added. There were different tones of voices used, but I stand firm on my question of equity. This is not about India, madam. This is about the entire world. Does climate change mean you give up equity? Madam, here is paragraph 4. Decides also to launch a process to develop a protocol, another legal instrument, or legal outcome under the UNFCCC. And I have been told, madam, before this process began, that unless you agree to drop the word legal outcome, the entire process will collapse and India will be blamed. Well, I stand here to tell the world that I am here to cooperate with the process. And I have agreed to legal instrument, though I don't agree with it. I have left the word protocol, though I don't agree with it. What is the problem of adding one more option? What is the problem, madam? Is it that certain parties have to say something and the entire world goes with it? Otherwise, the entire convention will collapse and India will be blamed? I'm sorry, madam. India will never be intimidated by threats or intimidation or any kind of pressure like this. Madam, what do I do, madam? What is this legal instrument that we are talking so passionately about? All I'm saying is, how do I give a blank check? I'm talking for my country. How do I give a blank check and sign away the livelihood? We are not talking about lifestyle sustainability that many richer and more fortunate countries than ours have. We are talking about livelihood sustainability. How do I give a blank check and give a legally binding agreement to sign away the rights of 1.2 billion people and many other people in the developing world? Is that equity, madam, I ask you? Is that equity? I don't even know what this document will be like. Where will equity figure there? What about the entire process of CBDR? What about I feel, madam, that there could be, I'm not accusing anybody. I don't doubt anybody's sincerity. I'm only wondering if there is an effort here to shift the burden of this entire climate change problem upon countries who have not cooperated, who have not contributed to this entire issue. And that is wrong, madam. And that is why we have CBDR. That is the reason we have CBDR. And that is the reason we should stick with CBDR. Is this a weak text, madam? Look at the last 3 paragraphs. Work plan on enhancing mitigation ambition. A range of mitigation actions. It raises the ambition levels. Mitigation actions will apply to everybody equally, even to countries as big as India, which have a per capita emission of 1.7. This is a weak text, madam. Is this the text that they want to reopen? Is this the text that parties want to reopen? We are willing to reopen it, madam. We are willing to reopen and talk about every word in this text. Madam, just before you came into this room, there was a discussion on the AWG LCA text. So many developing countries opposed that text. And the chair, in its wisdom, in spite of more countries opposing the text than supporting it, took it upon his responsibility to pass it on to you for adoption in the plenary. We accepted that as well. We did not issue threats to people. We did not say that we will make the multilateral process collapse. All I want to repeat here, madam, is that is there something that is going on for the multilateral process to collapse? Are we being made the scapegoats? I'm sorry, madam. I want to tell the world that this document was the product of 6 days of talking. All of us have talked over and over and over again. Again, madam, all our ideas were put forward, everybody was present, and this was the sense of the chair. If this text is going to be disturbed, then, madam, my respectful submission is we are willing to take every word because, madam, and I say this with pain, and I say this with humility, and I say this with a great deal of agitation. We have given so much. We have agreed on raising ambition levels. Our 3 agenda items have been pushed to some corner. They've been parked in a place. They're not adopted in the main text because we want to cooperate. We want to make this a success. We want to walk the extra mile as we've always done. Please don't hold us hostage, and please don't take our cooperation to be weakness. Finally, madam, we will give up the principle of equity. Let us finally announce then in Durban, which would be the greatest tragedy, the greatest pity, this historic city of Durban, if we finally say goodbye to the principle of equity, if I finally say goodbye to common but differentiated responsibility, that would be the biggest tragedy of all time. And I plead with you, madam, not to reopen. It is just one more option. How can that be a crime? How can we be accused of anything, madam? I've been told that we are going to collapse the process. I'm asking now, tell me, it's just one more option. How is it a crime? How is it wrong? And my final word, madam, if we are going to reopen the text, we are willing to do that and take every word for discussion again, particularly mitigation and ambition levels. Thank you, madam.
Well, you get some of the sense of the urgency and agitation, anxiety is the way she rephrased it, of her position here. She'd been threatened by the United States that if she didn't back down on some issues, she'd be blamed for the collapse of the whole meeting. She resisted that and said, no, we've got to retain this principle of equity. And we can't go back on the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities that was in the Kyoto text. So this is the kind of exchange that took place and isn't summarized easily in the documents. There's another intergenerational equity question and fairness question that was raised again in the hall, and this time by a woman who came from the College of the Atlantic in Maine here and stood up to represent the youth of NGOs around the world. This is an interesting idea.
To Ms. Anjali Appadurai with College of the Atlantic, who will speak on behalf of youth non-governmental organizations. Ms. Appadurai, you have the floor.
I speak for more than half the world's population. We are the silent majority. You've given us a seat in this hall, but our interests are not on the table. What does it take to get a stake in this game? Lobbyists, corporate influence, money? You've been negotiating all my life. In that time, you've failed to meet pledges, you've missed targets, and you've broken promises. But you've heard this all before. We're in Africa, home to communities on the front line of climate change. The world's poorest countries need funding for adaptation now. The Horn of Africa and those nearby in Kwamashu needed it yesterday. But as 2012 dawns, our Green Climate Fund remains empty. The International Energy Agency tells us we have 5 years until the window to avoid irreversible climate change closes. The science tells us that we have 5 years maximum. You're saying, give us 10. The most stark betrayal of your generation's responsibility to ours is that you call this ambition. Where is the courage in these rooms? Now is not the time for incremental action. In the long run, these will be seen as the defining moments of an era in which narrow self-interest prevailed over science, reason, and common compassion. There is real ambition in this room, but it's been dismissed as radical, deemed not politically possible. Stand with Africa. Long-term thinking is not radical. What's radical is to completely alter the planet's climate, to betray the future of my generation, and to condemn millions to death by climate change. What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach. 2011 was the year in which the silent majority found their voice, the year when the bottom shook the top. 2011 was the year when the radical became reality. Common but differentiated and historical responsibility are not up for debate. Respect the foundational principles of this convention. Respect the integral values of humanity. Respect the future of your descendants. Mandela said, "It always seems impossible until it's done." So, distinguished delegates and governments around the world, governments of the developed world, deep cuts now. Get it done.
Okay, get it done. That was the charge from the Intergenerational Command for Climate Change Action, in effect, showing up with a very forceful statement to those within the conference hall. This wasn't outside the conference hall, it was in the conference hall. There were other voices outside the conference hall that deserved to be heard as well. And Kumi Naidoo of Greenpeace International emerged as an important voice in what was termed Occupy Durban. An Occupy Durban movement got going and occupied some of the buildings of the negotiations without getting into the actual plenary sessions. Take a note of they're inside in some respects. They're inside the negotiators' building, but they're outside the assembly hall. And you'll see the dynamic here. It's worth picking it up in detail.
On Friday, just before the talks ended, more than 150 climate justice activists at the talks called for a breakthrough in the talks there. They marched to the conference hall in Durban before being told to leave by UN security. The head of Greenpeace, Kumi Naidoo, was among those expelled after the protests. This is a report from what many called Occupy COP17, though protesters were careful not to disrupt the actual negotiations.
Should we stay? Should we stay? Or should we go? Or should we go?
Now, we are challenged.
We are challenged
to show
the
highest level of maturity, dignity, and courage. We will show, unlike some of the governments in these negotiations, who talk democracy in one voice, and engage in awful acts of human rights abuses on the other, that we will show the highest tradition of peaceful civil disobedience, which is our right.
Okay, now you can see this was quite an interesting confrontation and went on, in fact, for a while until they were ousted from the meeting hall, which was not the meeting room itself, that is not the conference hall, but the inside the building where the conference hall was taking place. So they didn't interrupt the delegations' consultations themselves, but they held this right outside there. They were eventually ushered out of the building altogether, and they had to give up their official identity passes that got them in, but many of them were willing to do that and get arrested in the process. The key person outside of all of these exchanges that had a lot to do with the ultimate text was, in effect, a kind of mystery man to a lot of people. But here's the president and foreign minister of the South African government, president of the conference, and here's the mystery man, the U.S. delegate, Todd Stern. He's seen at several points, and other voices were heard that didn't even show up in South Africa. This is actually very interesting to hear and very impressive.
Republican Senator James Inhofe of Oklahoma recorded a video message that was aired at a press conference of climate change deniers here at the summit on Wednesday.
Hi, I'm Senator Jim Inhofe, a Republican senator from Oklahoma. Today I'm happy to bring you the good news about the complete collapse of the global warming movement and the failure of the Kyoto process as world leaders meet for the United Nations Global Warming Conference in Durban, South Africa. For the past decade, I've been the leader in the United States Senate standing up against global warming alarmism and cap and trade, which would have been the largest tax increase in the history of America. This victory is especially important today as families in America and around the world continue to face really tough economic times, and tossing out any remote possibility of a UN global warming treaty is one of the most important things we can do for the economy. I'm making this announcement from Washington, D.C., where I'm confident that the only person left talking about global warming is me. The message from Washington to the UN delegates in South Africa is this week could not be any clearer. You are being ignored.
Okay. You are being ignored is the message that Republican Senator Jim Inhofe wants to bring to the International Conference of Parties in South Africa. You are being ignored. Well, this is pretty much what the American delegate did, and although, as he said, he's in Washington making this broadcast, he's in effect manipulating the American delegation there and indicating that this isn't something that Republicans are going to support in any case, and that the American people regard it as an assault on their lifestyle. Well, you couldn't get a more dramatic representation of the difference between voices around the world than that of the Indian delegation and that of Republican senator from Oklahoma, representing a state which has historically been dominated by oil interests. It's a very interesting dynamic involved, but getting some of the assessment of others, like Kate Horner from the Friends of the Earth, or Bobby Peake, is important as well, and their information is available on the websites. Amy Goodman.
United Nations Climate Change Summit in Durban, South Africa has come to an end with an agreement to start negotiations for a new legally binding climate treaty to be decided by 2015 and to come into force by 2020. Negotiators also agreed to a second commitment period under the Kyoto Protocol and the initial design of a green climate fund. Many environmental groups said the agreement doesn't go far enough to deal with the climate crisis. For more, we go back to South Africa now, to Durban, South Africa, from where we have just returned, to two guests. Kate Horner is policy analyst with Friends of the Earth International, and Bobby Peake is joining us. He is a Durban environmental activist, director of Groundwork, the Durban-based environmental justice organization. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Kate, we spoke to you on Friday when we were all in Durban at the climate talks, which were extended through to Sunday. Now that the talks have concluded, can you analyze for us what has been decided?
The outcome of the talks here in Durban is unfortunately a very weak agreement that lacks in ambition, equity, and justice. The Kyoto Protocol that you mentioned, which is the only legally binding instrument that we have to address climate change, will continue only as an empty shell. Several countries, namely Canada, Russia, and Japan, have refused to put new targets on the table, and the countries that have signed up have only offered really shockingly low levels of ambition. The Bali Action Plan, which was agreed 4 years ago.
You can see that their assessment was not very positive, and in effect, keep in touch with these issues as we give you more information from week to week. Thanks very much. See you on air.